morning, and thank you for joining the Department of Water Resources for today's webinar, which is focused on basin boundary regulations and their implementation procedures. My name is Tanya Carlone. I'm a facilitator with the Center for Collaborative Policy, which is a division of Sacramento State University. I'm here with my colleague, Nicole Scanlon, who is operating today's webinar, providing technical support. The purpose of today's meeting is to provide local agencies an overview of DWR's basin boundary modification request requirements and procedures, and to conduct a demonstration of the tools and resources available to local agencies through the boundary modification request system, and to answer any questions that you may have pertaining to these tools. So let's go ahead and take a look at how you can submit questions on today's webinar. Only taking comments in written form today. You can go ahead and write your questions in the question box and go ahead and send them. Then your questions will be read aloud by a DWR staff, and we have Bill Brewster here from DWR who will be doing that today. While we will not get to all of your questions today, I have been told by DWR that no question will go unanswered. So we will make sure that all your questions are answered, and also before the end of today's webinar, we'll make sure that you have direct contact information to be in touch with DWR. Let's look at what we're going to cover today. On your screen, you can see a presentation overview. Next up, Tim Godwin, who is the engineering geologist with DWR's Sustainable Groundwater Management Program, will be presenting basin boundary regulations background. Now that the regulations are final, there will be something of a review of the requirements of these regulations, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. We're really going to spend most of our time today talking about the basin boundary modification process. And there's three distinct parts to this process, and Tim will go through each of them in turn. The first focuses on the resources available to local agencies. Tim will make a presentation, provide an online demonstration, and then you'll be able to ask questions, and we'll do that for each of these topics. We'll also make sure that you understand and know the timeline for implementation, and we'll talk about next steps, and we'll end with a question and answer session to make sure that whatever questions you want to bring forward, that you have the opportunity to do that today. We realize that today's webinar is happening very close to a time when many people take a holiday break, so be assured that a recording of this webinar will be made available to all those who wish to access it, and we will get that up and running very soon. So with that, I would really like to invite Tim Godwin to begin today's presentation, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Tanya, and thank you to all the participants joining us today on the webinar. We're pushing pretty hard to get basin boundary regulations implemented, and as many of you are aware, we are trying to establish some very resourceful tools to enable local agencies and public to engage in this process. And so today I'd like to talk very specifically about these topics. I'll cover the emergency regulations and generally how we got to where we're at now, and then the resources available to local agencies to comply. And we'll be interjecting several question opportunities throughout each of these topics, bullet listed here, as well as a final question and answer period at the end where we can maybe target some specific questions about some basin boundary modifications. So I'll dive right in with really how did we get to this point. So the basin boundary regulation process in terms of developing the regulation began back in May with the start of public listening sessions where the department went out and spoke with general public as well as multiple advisory groups where we dove into the details as to what the local agencies felt were critical components to help shape and control the way boundary modifications would occur and what was important to meeting specific local objectives and making this as flexible and operable as possible. So what I'll point out here is that the legislation mandated that these emergency regulations would be developed by January 1st 2016. Recognizing that there's a very strict timeline to get these modifications implemented to comply with the general process of SGMA, the department felt it necessary to really expedite this process, and we pushed as hard as we could. We made the final regulations were adopted by the California Water Commission in October, and were finally approved and instituted by the Office of Administrative Law on November 16th. So we're a little ahead of schedule there, but it required having these regulations completed before we could start the process of developing implementation tools and methods for local agencies to comply and provide information to support their modification requests. So we've got a good start on these tools, and I'd like to share with you today, what they look like and how we're going to use them, but just to provide some context of where we're coming from. So what you see here in front of you is the overall SGMA milestones and timelines. This is for the greater general SGMA program, but what I really want to focus in on is these highlighted boxes here. So I want to highlight that one, the boundary regulations effectively are scheduled for January 1 through March 31st is our first submission period the department is offering for local agencies to make boundary modification requests. This timeline is important because of several other key milestones that need to occur, which are the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations, which will be adopted in June of next year, and then more importantly and directly tied to the boundary regulations is the requirement to have GSAs formed for each basin by June 30, 2017. So you can see a clear understanding and definition of the basin boundary will be critical for GSAs to form and comply with that aspect of covering an entire basin. So what is a basin? We've talked in general about the process, but there are existing 515 groundwater basins and sub-basins identified within California. The map on the left highlights those basins within California, and of those 515, 127 are of high or medium priority and required to comply with SGMA and submit groundwater sustainability plans by either 2020 or 2022. So in particular, the definition of the basin that we're operating with is as defined in Bulletin 118/2003, and effectively demonstrates where porous groundwater flow is occurring within the state. In the basin illustrated here on the right, what you can see is the scientific boundaries reflect where these alluvial sediments or porous sediments abut against crystalline rock and define the limits of the greater basin. These basins are also subdivided into sub-basins based upon either scientific or jurisdictional means. So what you can see in this figure below is the red dashed line illustrates where these greater basins are divided to either comply with hydrology, or maybe there is some hydrogeologic formational differences in breaks which can allow for subdivision of the greater basin, or jurisdictional boundaries where it enhances the ability for locals to institute groundwater management practices. So these are the general terms by which we'll be looking at how to classify and categorize basin boundary modification requests in terms of compliance with the regulation. So compliance with the regulation, as we move through the process and you're completing your request to modify the basin, keep in mind that these primary bullets here identify the thinking behind the regulation as well as what is required by SGMA. So in general, basins, the department feels that it's best to define these basins based on the best available science. So we want to hear what locals have seen and identify as to where forest media flow is occurring within their basin and can identify where these resources should be managed in accordance with SGMA. In addition to that, as we mentioned earlier, internal boundaries can be created for jurisdictional and management purposes. And to that end, SGMA provides these general guidelines, and I'll read them briefly here, how to assess the likelihood that the proposed basin can be sustainably managed, how to assess whether the proposed basin would limit the sustainable management of an adjacent basin, and then how to assess whether there is a history of sustainable management of groundwater levels in the proposed basin. So with those three bullets, we've framed these regulations to provide detailed information necessary to demonstrate these components. So let's look at the regulatory framework here. This figure has been shown for quite a while in numerous presentations. One of the things that has come up during multiple conversations with other locals within the state is the necessity for basin boundary modification. I want to point out on this figure down here, the first selection box is should a local agency request a boundary modification. Many of these boundary modifications, especially with respect to subdivision of basins and subbasins within the state, can be addressed through the formation of GSAs. So GSAs can develop and formulate their own management strategies and simply need to coordinate within the basin to develop a GSP. So that would be the primary method for handling subdivision. If that's beyond what the local agencies feel is appropriate for management practices, then you can engage in the process. And the process, if you choose to modify a basin boundary modification, has three primary steps. The first of which is to notify the department. This is what we call the initial notification, and we'll go into this in detail later. And that's just simply to signify that a particular local agency is interested in developing a boundary modification request. It doesn't require that the local agency actually submit the request. It just simply is a flag to say, we're thinking about it. And the intent there is to notify other local agencies within the basin, notify the stakeholders within the basin, and to identify to the DWR that there's a significant volume of requests coming so we can be prepared to move through review of these requests as expeditiously as possible. So step two then becomes complying with the specific requirements as it pertains to the information required for us to evaluate criteria for the boundary modification request. And those criteria are specific to the type of modification being made. The primary division is scientific versus jurisdictional. So scientific modifications are those based upon existing scientific studies that demonstrate the extent of groundwater flow within a basin and where it is limited based upon hydrogeologic constraints. This is the foundational understanding of the groundwater basin and will be essential to groundwater management to know what those extents are. The jurisdictional component are those that effectively engage and aid in management strategies. As you can see, there's a series of requirements for each of these, and those are highlighted in the Basin Boundary Management System request tool, which we'll cover later. And you'll be guided through this process as to what information to provide. Once you've provided this information, there's an opportunity for comment and review by the general public, the stakeholders, through meetings that the department will hold as to those boundaries which we have identified as being approved for consideration. Once we go through those processes, we'll also present this information to the California Water Commission for hearing and comment. And following incorporation of all the comments received, those basins will be identified and finalized within an update to Bulletin 118 in 2017. And the purpose there is so that these basin definitions can be in place prior to the final definition of Groundwater Sustainability Agency formation. So why don't we stop here and answer some questions regarding the regulatory process and regulations in general.
Yeah, so please submit your questions again in your question box, specifically that apply to the presentation that Tim just made, where he reviewed the general requirements of the basin boundary regulations. Phil, do we have some questions that have come in on this topic?
Yeah, we have a few questions, and I'm thinking some of these may be answered later on, but I'll let Tim mention if he's going to touch on these later, or he can answer them now. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is, what is the process of filing a protest to a basin modification?
It's a great question, and yes, there is a protest process. Well, we call it public input. We value all input for these boundary modification requests, both in support and in opposition of it. And I'll walk through the process to how this is done. The tool we've developed will enable folks to provide comments and for the requesting agency to respond to the comments. So, and all of this is transparent, will be available for everybody to view. So we'll cover that.
Yeah, it sounds like we'll actually see a demonstration of that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and are basin boundaries and improved modifications permanent, or can they be changed in the future?
Another good question. Yeah, they can definitely be changed in the future. So that's a nice segue in that the SGMA process, the department views as an iterative process. Local agencies, as we make some assumptions about the basin and what the management strategies are and start to implement these, we may find that those assumptions may be inaccurate, and we may learn more about the basin, and refinements of those basin definitions will be critical to continuing to manage the basin properly. So yes, most definitely there'll be future opportunities to modify basins.
Okay, and then can basin boundaries extend beyond groundwater basins? Could SGMA eventually cover the whole state?
Again, good question. Currently, right now, SGMA is refined to those groundwater basins identified in Bulletin 118. So Bulletin 118 is available on our website, and I can show you those resources when we get into the next section.
Okay, and there's a few more questions coming in, and I'm going to review them. Why don't we go ahead and continue, and then
sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just mention that while Phil is reviewing these, we do have an opportunity at the very end of the session to revisit some of the questions that some of you may have already submitted. Thank you. Go on, Tim. Thanks.
Okay. So now we'll dive into a bit more of the nitty-gritty and the boundary modification process. What needs to be done to submit a modification request? So here's a quick timeline. We'll walk through this. What I want to point out down here, these are the legislatively mandated SGMA deadlines. So these deadlines are critical to driving this process and the rationale for why we only have a 3-month window here to institute the first basin boundary modification request. So step 1 is to provide initial notification. Again, we talked about this briefly, but this is a great way to open the lines of communication with other local agencies within the basin, with stakeholders and the department to start to frame up a boundary modification request. We don't want this to be done in a black box. We have a lot of resources available for local agencies to use, and we're here to answer questions. So at the end of this slideshow are a series of email addresses and contact information so that local agencies can reach out to the regional offices or headquarters and talk to us about their thoughts and how they want to proceed and maybe get some clarification. So step 2, we enter the initial boundary request window. So this is a 3-month window, again, running from January 1 to March 31st. And this is the opportunity for local agencies to submit their requests. We're going to go through very shortly here what this tool, what these tools are, and specifically where you can get some of this information to comply with the regulation. Step 3 is the evaluation of these requests, approval, and publication of Bulletin 118. And immediately you can see that our target is by end of September 2016, we have the boundary modification request evaluated and a draft approval list prepared. From this, we are required to present to the California Water Commission to hear and comment, and that also has a 30-day comment period associated with it. So we gain as much information as possible to finalize these basin boundary modifications. At that point, we will finalize these and document them in an update to Bulletin 118 in early 2017. As part of this, the department is also required to reprioritize the new basin definitions. A basin prioritization is a ranking system and requires that all the basin definitions be completed, and we know exactly how they stack against one another. And this process is also identified within the department website if you need more information on that. But this is a required component to identify those basins which are required to comply with SGMA. I will say this, that the basin prioritization, as in response to SGMA, has changed from the initial prioritization process and has incorporated considerations to groundwater dependent ecosystems and surface water depletion. As such, it is believed that existing basin prioritizations are unlikely to change despite a change in basin boundary modification. But each will be considered as part of this process and evaluated under a specific set of standards. So once we've completed this initial window and GSAs have been formed, if at a later date there is a clear necessity that additional boundary modifications may be necessary, we may be able to accommodate that need in late 2018 and try and develop another boundary modification request prior to submission of the GSPs in 2020. But those will be, that decision will be made based upon the need across the state. However, I do want to signal that there are going to be continued opportunities to revise basin boundaries. And those opportunities will be tied to updates to Bulletin 118, which are legislatively directed to occur on years that end in 0 and 5. So an update in 2020, an update in 2025, and so forth and so on. So let's dive into the resources available to local agencies to comply with the regulation. We understand and we recognize that this is a lot of information to try and compile for local agencies in a very short time frame. So we've tried our best to develop some sources for this information, and I want to walk you through some of where you can find some of these resources, at least to guide you through this process and get you started. So there are two primary tools. One is the website, the General Basin Boundary Modification website, which we will try and go to now. Oops, and we'll switch that for you. So currently, I am on the DWR website, and what you can see is right up front is a very clear stepwise procedure for local agencies to follow to comply with the regulation. Within this step process is a series of links, one to the specific regulations, the final regulations, two to the Basin Boundary Modification System to provide initial notification, the Basin Boundary Assessment Tool, which is another resource we'll cover next, and then the tool to submit your modification request. If you scroll further down the table, we have another section called Basin Boundary Modification Resources. Here's a series of tools that can aid in answering some of these specific questions you may have regarding the process. So again, much of the same information, the timelines, a fact sheet, a checklist, and we have additional information we're going to be providing within the next week that will help guide you through this process further and provide additional information and resources. So from this, I'd like to point out that the next resource tool is the Basin Boundary Assessment Tool. And that can be found over here on the right. This is a great panel, and this is consistent throughout the department website to guide you through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. There's lots of links in here. Here's the initial basin prioritization, additional resources and links, the Groundwater Information Center, Bulletin 118 information, CASGIM. But for this purpose, I'd like to focus this in on the basin boundary modifications. So here's the Basin Boundary Assessment Tool. We call this BBAT for short, and it's a tremendous set of tools driven by a GIS format. Just to lay out the general constraints of the tool, what I'd like to illustrate is there are a series of tabs over here on the left. This is your control panel to control the various information and coverages that are available for you to use to identify what's going on within the basin. And then on the right is a window that you can hide that, now I can see it. That provides additional information regarding each of the coverages that are available. And there's links to chase out and to follow to get more information about each of those. So I'd like to dive in very quickly on an example basin that we'll use throughout the presentation here. Sorry. And I'm going to use the South American subbasin of the Sacramento Valley Basin. I'm using this only because headquarters is located here, not because we know of particular modifications that may be planned or occurring. I just want to make that very clear. It's just an example, and it's because it's where we're sitting. So what I'd like to share with you is you can click on the map. There's additional information that shows up. You can see there's tabs within this information window. And as we build this out, you'll see that there's a pull-down list and lots of information embedded here. One thing I want to point out right away is if you select the basin, you can quickly click on the link, and it takes you directly to the Bulletin 118 page about this particular subbasin. This is a tremendous resource for identifying hydrogeologic information. One of the requirements for each request is to develop a hydrogeologic conceptual model. Here is the majority of the information you will need to provide that hydrogeologic conceptual model. So that opens up, and it's a separate tab within your web browser. We're going to go back to the tool. I'd like to add in some other layers now, so I'm going to switch the window here on the left, and you can see there's multiple coverages provided here. One that I'd like to add in is, let's add in the county boundaries. So now we can understand where the counties are. We can use the slider to make them darker or lighter so it doesn't obscure your view. Close the information window so you can see this develop. Let's add in our water agencies within the region. Suddenly you can see it gets very crowded very quickly and difficult to see. Again, use the slider to screen that back. We can gain more information. I'm going to zoom in on the South American Basin, and we're going to now click in an area, and you can see that this information box has changed and has multiple tabs. So if you use the window, the toggles up at the top that allow you to navigate these boundaries, you can see, I can look and see, okay, I'm in the Sacramento County. Here's a water agency, the city of Sacramento within this basin. Here's another water agency within this basin, Sacramento County. And then there's a pull-down list so you can navigate more quickly between them. So from this, you can see, for example, and we'll continue to pull on this, that the Bulletin 118 boundary lies, within a water agency down here. Now, there may be a desire for an internal boundary modification. This will be the example we work through as we submit, that moves this boundary to this agency edge to enable better sustainable management. So this is a tool for you to evaluate where that occurs, how this information is laid out, and what's going on. Some other coverages I'd like to point out very quickly here are the groundwater management plan. You can click on this, simply click on the information and find the groundwater management plan and select these plans, download the plans. Again, another source for good information regarding the basin for you to use in the submission package. Some other information in here might be, military ranges, tribal land, Prop 1 funding areas, hydrologic regions, the region office service areas. So I'd like to point that out because this is a tremendous resource for you to use to identify which region office your basin lies in. These are the technical experts within your region that will help address questions you have regarding basin boundary modification. And there's a contact list at the end of this presentation that will be available for you to use as a resource. So one of the most compelling tools that the department feels is available for use by the local agencies is the addition of the geologic references. And this is the primary tool used to identify where basins are occurring. I'm going to go ahead and select the geology for the California Geologic Service 250,000 scale map. We can screen it back a little bit so it's not so overbearing. We're going to select, let's get back to our South American sub-basin example. What I can do is zoom in and see, is this contact right? Are we meshing up well with what is defined as the alluvial components versus the crystal and bedrock components? So this is a tool for local agencies to evaluate those conditions and determine whether or not some modification may be necessary to incorporate areas that may have previously been precluded. So this is the BBATS tool, the Groundwater Basin Boundary Assessment tool, and a tremendous resource for local agencies to evaluate what is going on within their basin, where some of these modifications may be necessary for management purposes, and to inform their decision about whether or not a modification is appropriate. One of the other items I would like to demonstrate here very briefly is that the department has identified that Bulletin 118 was developed prior to SGMA and didn't have the necessary drivers that to require very specific high-end quality control. As such, the department has recognized that some of these descriptions within Bulletin 118 and the line work available doesn't mesh well. And the department has made a series of administrative edits, and those can be found here. So as part of this revision process, you can see several basins are being modified, and you can review what those modifications are by simply clicking on these and identifying where they're located and what that change will be. As such, the line work for these Bulletin 118 basins is going to be provided to you as part of the tool when you go to provide your line work for the revised boundary modification request. So this is the BBATS tool. We'll end the presentation and move on to the next step. There we go. Sorry. So again, we covered the website as a resource and then the basin boundary assessment tool. Again, some screenshots evaluating just exactly what we just described. This one illustrates the prioritized basins in the orange and yellow colors signify high and medium prioritization. This coverage is included in there as well. The geologic references we talked about. We've gone through that. So I guess we can stop now for some more questions.
Yeah, so thanks for that really exciting demonstration, Tim. Really. So Bill, what questions have people sent that are relevant to what we just discussed?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions that have been coming in, so I'll try to combine them and maybe paraphrase a few of them. So there are some questions about the timing between GSA formation and basin boundary modification. So I'll synthesize some of the questions by asking if the GSA forms and wants to do a basin boundary modification after the window's open, what provisions will DWR make for those types of changes?
Well, a GSA is a qualified and eligible local agency as part of the regulations. So if you've already formed your GSA and it has been documented with the department through the process, that is an eligible local agency to provide a modification request and can simply follow the procedures outlined here.
The GSA is formed after the window closes, and then wants to make a change. So there's questions related to the time.
Got you. Okay. So the window right now, you may be considering formation of a GSA. You don't need to be a GSA to make a basin boundary modification request. Any local agency that has water or land use is qualified to, is eligible, I should say, to request modification of the basin boundary. So if a component of a proposed GSA wants to make this request, they can move forward with that as requesting agency.
Okay, and then we have a number of questions related to the outer basin boundaries. For example, how will DWR consider volcanic areas or basin boundary modifications that would include volcanic areas?
Sure. So I used a couple of terms earlier, porous media flow versus fractured flow. This is kind of the primary division between these areas. So in some cases, a volcanic deposit may be reworked fluvially. So in other words, having been reworked by water deposits, may still be considered a volcanic material, but it may be porous and commute water in a significant quantity for production purposes. That would likely be included as part of the basin if it's currently identified as a basin within Bulletin 118. If there are scientific studies that exist that demonstrate that these areas respond similarly, those are things we would like to consider if a region feels that that's critical to their sustainable practice of the basin.
Okay, and then there were also a number of questions related to the current line work that we have. So this is kind of a multi-part question I'll phrase to you. So is DWR currently reviewing the geologic boundaries, and what if a boundary doesn't properly track the what's visible on the ground if the line is in the wrong place? And how would an agency request for an administrative edit to their basin?
Great. Those are all great questions. And Bill, it's ironic you're asking the question since you are really the lead in this aspect for the department in guiding this system. I'll take a stab at this in general. Yes, the department is reviewing geologic contacts. We are looking as they are defined within Bulletin 118 text description. If the text indicates that it is following a specific geologic contact, we're looking at it. We have prioritized a series of basins that we feel are in error in a significant fashion that we hope to address right away. And ideally, we want to be working with basins that have identified that and work with them to resolve. However, it is really dependent upon the text description within Bulletin 118. It is the key deciding factors whether or not that qualifies as an administrative edit or not. Do you have any other thoughts or comments on that one?
Yeah, other than I'd just like to add that we're currently working on reviewing the basin boundaries, the high and medium basins, and DWR will have recommendations on what we, or at least provide information about our findings on this boundary, but we're not done with that review yet. So when we're complete, when that review is complete, it will be made available. So I think that's good. There's still a number of questions that are coming in. There are questions related to GSA formation that aren't really related to the timing with basin boundaries. So I think we'll probably not answer those today because they're specific to GSAs.
Right.
Any questions related to GSPs and those regulations, we're going to pass over today.
Yeah, and just to respond to that thought is that at the end of the presentation, I also have a series of links that direct you to information on our website and contacts to resolve some specific questions pertaining to GSAs or GSPs or other aspects of the program.
Okay. And then one question related to basin boundary modification requests for adjudicated basins. Is there any special consideration for that?
Well, yeah, to a point, the adjudicated basins or adjudicated areas, I guess the one point there is that a water master does not qualify as a local agency and eligible to make a request. However, water master typically represents several local agencies within that adjudicated area, and those local agencies are eligible to make requests. And yeah, we anticipate that there will be some requests for boundary modification within some of the adjudicated areas, and ideally they, are helping to meet SGMA requirements.
Okay, is that it, Bill?
I think that's good for now. I think that summarizes most of what's coming in.
Okay, and one moment, I just want to let you all know that we are really going to be taking questions today that are relevant to these topics. And we will not be addressing every question that comes in during the webinar. However, as I said before, DWR will have a record of all of these questions, and they will answer, and they will get back to you and answer them.
Great.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, so we've covered the local agency resources that are available. There are additional resources external to the department for water quality information, hydrogeologic information through the USGS or the state board, and we have provided links for those through our website. So don't be afraid to explore. There's a lot of information that is readily available out there to help inform your submission package. So what I'd like to dive into now is how do local agencies submit their information, and how are people going to engage in this process and view what's going on. So we have developed and are currently developing the Basin Boundary Modification System. You'll see it. This tool is used for both submission by local agencies, and you can see there's a component here for local agencies, and then a component down here for public and interested parties. Effectively, the local agencies will develop and sign in, log in, create a user account, and they'll be able to access and edit their submission throughout the process to the point at which we have deemed the package complete. Once the submittal is complete, that opens up a 30-day public input period, and public and interested parties will be allowed to come in and provide an electronic comment to the submission and an opportunity for the local agency to respond to that comment and provide some feedback. So again, what we're looking for here is the clearest and most scientifically robust definition of a groundwater basin. That's the primary focus for the department. We want these defined clearly so local agencies can manage them effectively and have the greatest success at meeting sustainable goals. So we're going to dive in a little bit and look into just exactly what this process looks like. So initial notification is the first step. And we've had many questions regarding initial notification. This is an addition following the release of the draft regulations in July, and one of the final components we added to the regulation. And the general intent is to, again, signal to other local agencies that somebody is wanting to modify the boundary within the basin. Also talk to the stakeholders that are within the basin, both general public as well as other entities, and just flag to the department that there are some considerations going on there, and we can be aware of what's happening. So the requirement of 15 days within the decision to explore the boundary modification. Several comments or questions have come into the department regarding this, and I think the easiest way to look at this is, the intent behind it is to allow local agencies to have a conversation. Hey, we're thinking about this. But when it comes time to identifying that this needs to be approved by our governing board, and it is going to be ideally agendized in a meeting that is open to the public, that's probably a good indicator that this notification should be submitted. The idea is, again, just to open up the communication and make people aware so coordination can occur to the greatest extent possible. So we've talked about when to submit it and why it's necessary. Now let's look at how we do this. So I'm going to follow this link, and it's going to take us to a development site where we are currently working on making this system robust and functional for you. Again, just to highlight what we looked at before, I'm going to run through just how easy it is to provide an initial notification. So we're just going to go through the process, and we're going to see what the result is in the end. So you open up the page of the local agency. You can create a new notification. You just simply log in. You submit an agency name, and many of these are already listed. Sorry, none of the DWR testing agency is one we created. That's me. So we'll go ahead. I'm going to log in. Pardon me. I forgot my password. Awesome. Okay. So this is a submission I created earlier. We're just going to go ahead and add a new submission. So what you can see is the data structure behind it remembers all of the information we've added in the past. So it aids in filling this thing out. There's a total of 6 fields to complete here. So once you complete the contact information, this is the local agency information. This is a point of contact, so we can communicate and talk about this if necessary. We want to provide a web link where additional information will be stored. Some information regarding the description of the basin boundary modification you want to make, maybe what type it is, what it's going to do. And then you can select which basin it is that you're going to modify. So again, I'm going to use my example. And what you notice is as you type it in, it pops up a list. And we can come down and select our basin. It's notifying me that, hey, there's other submissions going on within the basin. This is an opportunity. Hey, maybe I should reach out to Apple Valley or DWR testing agency and determine whether or not there is an opportunity to coordinate our efforts and make this streamlined. I will point out that the regulation does require coordination of basin boundary modification requests to the greatest extent possible. What does that mean? That, to us, is basically requiring local agencies to resolve conflicting submission requests on a local level. We don't feel that the department should be making a decision as to whose submission request is better. We want the locals to resolve this situation, as after all, the locals will be managing groundwater within the basin moving forward. This coordination is critical to the success of SGMA, and we feel that's the best way to engage this system. So once you select your basin, now we ask you to provide a map. Either you can upload a file with your map, or simply click on the interactive map to show us in general where this modification is going to occur. So in my example, I think I said we were going to move a boundary down here on the southern flank to accommodate some water agency boundaries. So we're just going to click here on the map. Hello. Oh, I'm sorry. First, we're going to select what type of line we're going to create, which is a polyline or a polygon. You're either going to redefine the entire basin, you may choose an area, or a specific line. And we're just going to click on the map, and you can make all kinds of shapes. Once you have identified the line work you want to do, so in other words, I would like to move this basin boundary south to the red line. Again, there's lots of information out here on the right that will aid in providing some of that information. Save your results. And we save. Your notification was submitted successfully. And just so you're aware, an email is sent out to DWR to allow us to know that this has occurred. DWR also sends out an email to the local agency saying this is your information and thank you for submitting. And your initial notification is complete. We can go to the map and view very specifically the submissions that have occurred within the state. So you can see there's several within our test case where we've submitted. You can zoom in on the basin and see that, yes, there's the modification I just submitted. So that's all there is to it, to initial notification. It's fairly straightforward and easy to work through. We've had, I think, a total of 7 who have submitted initial notification at this point, and the feedback has been good that this is a usable tool and very easy to navigate. So with that, I guess we can pop back to the presentation. Again, here's a quick snapshot of that screen for folks to see, and you can log into the tool right now, while we're discussing this, and view what the current true initial notifications are. Again, we're looking at a development site, so a lot of these are test cases, but that is, in general, the process to submit the initial intent. Submitting initial notification is required prior to submitting the true modification request. So in submitting the modification request, step 1 is preparing that request. You need to make that initial notification. You need to start to perform the required notification and consultation with local agencies. This is information you're going to need to do. So again, the BBAS tool is a great way to identify other local agencies where this might be your request might be affecting, or adjacent agencies that might be interested in what's going on. We're asking that you reach out to them and let them know that this is what's going on, and this is why you're doing it, and ideally coordinate with them and make the best educated decision moving forward for sustainable management. You may choose to push forward and get your board approvals in line. Some modification requests require board approvals, and both from the requesting agency as well as supporting agencies. And then you're going to gather the required information per the regulation and the BBMRS package. One thing I want to note very quickly here is we are currently developing a worksheet, and that worksheet will post a bulk worksheet on the web page that will show every requirement for every type of modification. But as you start to get into the tool, we'll be able to customize that worksheet so you can see very clearly the information you need to provide, and you can work offline to gather that and collect your thoughts as it pertains to your specific modification request. So with that, let's dive into the next step, which is submitting the basin boundary modification request. So this is the opening screen following logging in. It's fairly straightforward to navigate this system as well. What you can see is there's 4 main topics here: the creating a new request. I can edit an existing request I've submitted. You can view all of the requests that have been submitted, and then you can view all of these on a map. Let's just take a look at the map very quickly to illustrate just kind of what this tool is going to look like as we start to implement. So what you can see here is there's several basins that have been selected. If you zoom in, you can click on this basin. You can see here's an example. You can click to get additional details, and it'll take you out and show you the submission and information that has been provided in support of that boundary modification request. We're going to go back to our tool, and we're going to go back to home. So let's look at an existing request that I've submitted in the past. Again, this is South American subbasin example where I've requested to do an internal boundary request. So as we drill into the actual forms that you are going to be required to populate, I want to point out a couple of items. One, the screen over here on the left is a series of menus, and they're broken down into categories A through, actually they go through K, I believe. I'm sorry, L. And you can see some have a check mark on them and some do not. So there's a set of internal evaluations whether or not I have fully complied with the required information for this package to be submitted. So in the required documentation, you can see there is no check. So I can scroll through here and identify, well, where did I not provide additional information? Oh, and there's a box that's empty. So I might need to add some additional information here. And I press continue. And then we see that component has been checked, and I'm ready to move on. Let's just walk through all of the various components here. So the general application, this is just application. Contact information, requesting manager, pretty straightforward. I can come back and update this at any time. The description, here you're providing a general short description of what's being modified. Here you select the type of modification being made. And I'll point out, you can select multiple types. So you may have a submission where you are performing an external scientifically based boundary, but you also have a small fragment that you need to modify on an internal jurisdictional basis. So you can submit both of those, and then depending upon what you select here will allow you to update the criteria over here on the left. It will add additional fields. Is there a way for me to hide this? Sorry, dealing with some technical.
Just stand by for a second, and we'll get back to the presentation.
So just to highlight this, I'll go ahead and edit this. So as you can see, as I start to check additional components, and I say continue, it says, hey, these changes might modify your request. Yes, okay. Now you can see I have a much longer list of components required to submit additional information on. And so each type of submission will have specific criteria that you have to provide, and the worksheet that you'll develop to help you offline will be based upon these selected criteria. So I'm going to back out of this just so I can walk you through the demonstration a little further, back to where I was at, which is a jurisdictional internal boundary modification. And we're going to walk through the process. So general descriptions, very straightforward, easy to complete. Much of this information is either readily available via the resources we've demonstrated before, and what I would suggest is just keep some of those open in other tabs above. So things like the BBAT tool or some specific documentation that you may have on your basin where you can copy and paste or upload specific files. So let's look at some of the required documents. So one thing to note is, you know, we want to make this streamlined, and we're working on a lot of this information where just simply copy of statutory information, for example. If you have this information and it includes additional information with it, you can simply upload the file. So you simply choose a file, and you can select it, and it uploads. Once that file is uploaded, you have the opportunity then to review existing documents you've already uploaded and reselect them to upload. And that should streamline and limit the amount of uploading you need to do. So there's lots of ways to select information. You can select multiple files to upload. We'll select those, and you can see it quickly adds them. You can remove them by hitting the garbage can on the left and reduce that file set. So there's some flexibility there. One of the components you'll see, this one has a tooltip that pops up. Just to give you an idea that we are currently working with this program, we are writing these tooltips right now. So hopefully by January 1, all of these tooltips we've populated, they'll have references back to the specific regulation citation that topic relates to, as well as some potential sources of information where you can drill into to find information to complete it. One of the critical components of this is to provide detailed, accurate line work for your revised or your boundary modification request. And so I'd like to highlight that process here. So through selecting the basin that you're asking to modify, it is providing a request to the map to say, hey, I'm only looking at this basin. We're asking that you download this information. So you simply click on the link, and you can see down here, it is downloading a GIS shapefile for that particular basin. We ask that you use this shapefile, unzip it, modify it using GIS to reflect your proposed line work. Once you've done that, you can see here, I'm switching to Windows Explorer, and once you've expanded that file, modified it, you can save it. Then you're required to compress it. And so what you can see here is I've modified my file, I've compressed it, and now I'm ready to upload it again. So we're going to choose a file. I'm going to locate that file. Bear with me a moment. And we're going to upload it. And now it's been uploaded. I'm replacing the file that was on there before. So once I've uploaded the file, I have an opportunity to view the file I revised. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not on the right screen. Technical difficulties, I apologize. Thank you. So we're back at the modification request system, and just to, I'll just walk through what we just did. I selected the file here, the zip file, we upload it, and you can see it's populated quickly here. Now we have two. I'm going to remove one of them. So that should reflect the most recent version of my proposed line work. In order to review that, you can simply click on the link out here to view on map. And it shows me, oh yeah, here's my modification I made, my jurisdictional internal boundary modification. What you notice is that the shapefile now shows up in red and signifies that this is a proposed new line work for the South American subbasin. You can close the preview and continue with your application process. So you can run through the entire scenario, evaluating each of the components, and you can see in most cases there's a text box or a file upload, or in some cases the potential to include a URL link. See if we can find one of those. Sorry. We can continue to walk through the process. So here's a couple of last completions that we need to add. I'm just going to pick a file to populate this as a demonstration. Not important what the content is, just so we can complete all the required fields. Again, maybe I want to choose a file that's already been previously uploaded. I can come this way. You can see that's uploaded. We can add multiple files that way. We'll continue. You can see that H was completed, had the check mark. Now we're on to the last section. Here we need to provide a URL. We'll just use our friend Google to help populate that. Save. Okay, it's been saved. And then the final step would be to submit. Oh, it says I don't have something complete. Let's choose a file. We're finalizing some of the required field checks on this, so bear with me. Some of this is a little overkill at this point. We're revising this so that either a URL or a file upload will meet the required standards. Now we'll submit. Request has been submitted successfully, and we're done. At this point, what I want to point out is the current status. So until I click on submit, my status for my submission is draft. And it will remain draft until the requesting agency selects submit. The department, when it views that a request has been submitted, is the queue for us to review that submission for completeness. Now, the completeness check is just simply to validate that the required information has been provided. It'll be a high-level review. This looks like accurate information, looks like it's on track. And if there's anything missing, you know, that's an opportunity for the department to reach out to the requesting agency and fill those data gaps should they exist. Following the complete review, if a submission is reviewed and is deemed complete, DWR will change that flag to completed. At that point, there's a series of email notifications that go around at each of these status changes, and the department is utilizing the Sigma program email list server, which there's a link later on, to communicate out to the general public and all interested parties as to those basins that have been, the status is changed or modifications been made to the request. So if you want to be informed about changes within your basin, that's the best way, is to be on the Sigma program email listserv, and we can provide that list. That link is provided in the presentation, will be posted and is on the website as well. So that's the general procedures behind the completion of a boundary modification request. As I pointed out, there's other requirements based upon the type of modification you request, and it's similar format and steps you through each of the requirements that you can provide that information for review. So what I'm going to do now is back out again, and we're going to look at the map. And very quickly, we can zoom in and see, yes, here's our test, and there's the details, and here's the report, and we know that the information is been submitted and is available and can be reviewed. The line work's coming in now, so you can start to see some of the various modifications that have occurred within the basin. So again, we're working on this, and it's improving every day. So January 1, we'll go live with this, and these tools will be made available to requesting agencies and local agencies looking to submit a basin modification request. Let's go back to the PowerPoint slide. I think we're into, again, just a quick screenshot to familiarize yourself and remind you, if you choose to just download the presentation, it'll be made available, how things are laid out, where you can find them. So let's dive into some questions.
Yeah, let's take some questions specific to the local agency submission procedures that Tim just covered. So, but let's come in.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions. Some of them are fairly specific, good questions. So one regarding initial notifications. Can initial notifications be edited once they are submitted? Specifically, can lines be added or adjusted to a map once the notification is submitted?
Yes, most definitely. So, and that's the purpose of creating a user ID and password, is that the requesting agency submitting that initial notification can come back in and edit it, and it's very transparent. It shows, it's mapped out to everybody has access to it, and you can quickly see what those edits were. Anything that changes, what the department is doing is reviewing changes over a 2-week interval, and we're blasting out email to notify anybody who's interested in the process that this particular basin has had a modification to the request process.
Okay, and then regarding the basin boundary modification request, is DWR requiring that these requests come in using this online format, or can other reports be submitted?
Yes, the department is requiring the use of the submission system. So this tool will help the department expedite the review of these applications. The point of this is to get through the review process as quickly as possible to inform local agencies that their boundary modification has been approved or denied, so that they can make informed decisions in developing the appropriate GSAs to cover the basin and manage moving forward.
Okay, and then can these requests be printed out before they're submitted?
Yes, and we can pop over and I can show you some of the print functions very quickly. Let's just view all requests. And so these are all test cases, examples that we worked through. I'm going to go back to mine because I know what's there. And so what we can do is click on print preview, or print view. And what you can see is it prepares a nice report, shows the contact information, the maps, the answers, and the responses we provided. It provides a link to attachments and makes it all very accessible that you can print this out and provide it to or display it on a local agency's website that this was our submission package, and point towards where people can get more information about it.
And is that prior to submittal or after submittal?
You can print out your progress at any point along the way, through the draft process, through the submitted process, wherever you're at, whatever your status is, you can press print. And the worksheets effectively are going to reflect that print guidance that you just saw and have those components in there that you can print out and utilize as a worksheet, offline, So you can be making notes and preparing your information prior to diving into the tool.
Okay, and then are ArcView shapefiles required for this, or can other file types be submitted? What if an agency doesn't have ArcView?
Right. Yes, ArcView shapefiles are required for submission, and again, this is for the need of expediency and developing the review of this package so we can get through the process and reprioritize these basins so the local agencies are informed of their current status well ahead of the GSA deadline. We want you to have as much information as possible, and that step will save a significant amount of time in terms of processing the entire state request for modifications. And if somebody does not have access to GIS, the department will work with you. So please reach out. We're here to help.
Contact the local region office.
Yes, please.
Okay, just one more regarding sort of the definition of interior versus exterior change. So if an adjustment between two subbasins, if you're making an adjustment between or an internal boundary between two subbasins, is that an interior or exterior adjustment? So what is an interior and exterior boundary?
Sure. You know, I think it might be best for us to look at a map, and we can discuss it that way. So I'm back at the BBAPS tool, and I'm going to turn off a few coverages to help clarify this a bit for us. We're going to turn off the counties. I'm going to turn off the region boundaries. And let's just look at Bulletin 118 coverages. Okay. So, for example, we're going to look at the Sacramento Valley Basin. So the Sacramento Valley Basin is bound on the east by contact with the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Ranges, the Coast Ranges on the west side, and discharges through the delta at the bottom. So within this large basin is a series of subbasins. So if I were to click on any one of these subbasins, you can see that the basin name is identified as Sacramento Valley, and the subbasin name is Colusa in this case. And these subbasins, you know, are all part and member to the Sacramento Valley. So in looking at how these relate, we have an external boundary which defines the Sacramento Basin. It runs around the margins and contact between the alluvial valley sill and the more crystalline consolidated rock of the surrounding mountainous area. And that would be the external boundary contact. And those ideally are defined solely by scientific basis. There is no external boundary jurisdictional boundary line. So as we move to the interior of the basin, we see a series of lines in here like this that abut between the Colusa subbasin and the Corning subbasin. These internal lines are jurisdictional. They may be following hydrology lines, streams, creeks, or the like. They may follow geologic contact lines, looking at different soil profiles. Those lines, and they may follow, you know, river streams or water agency boundaries, so jurisdictional boundaries. So these are internal lines, and these are the external lines.
So is it fair to say that adjacent basins are separated by an internal line, and if a basin is adjacent nothing, that line is an external line?
Yes, and there are some unique circumstances within our highly variable state and basin definitions within the state, and you know, we handle those on a case-by-case basis. But yes, in general, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to move on because we do only have about 40 minutes remaining, and we have one other topic under the Basin Boundary Modification process, and that is the public input procedure. So Tim will move on to that, and then we'll have time for some additional questions.
Great. So I think this one's a little more streamlined than those of the past. Hopefully we won't get lost in the weeds too much. But the public input is, as I pointed out earlier, a critical component to the boundary modification request process. And the department does truly value the perspectives and local knowledge around the groundwater systems within the state. As I pointed out earlier, the hydrogeologic systems within the state are very variable, and the local understanding has the opportunity to observe these conditions and know where these occur. And so we rely very heavily on sound scientific information that helps us define what those boundaries are. And that will really enable the locals to manage the basin on a sustainable basis. So one thing I want to point out about the public input process in particular is there is specific regulation, specifically 343.12, the public input process, which defines and classifies specifically what that should contain. And so I alluded to it briefly there, but we're really looking for public input that is founded in science and provides a consistent level of information to that of the boundary modification request. So if a boundary modification request is based upon aquifer level, groundwater level responses, we would expect that a response might address a similar, aquifer response type of argument. So again, we would really like to see those scientifically based input to help define the basin as accurately as possible. So with that, the Basin Boundary Modification Request System is the location where those comments will be submitted. And so here's a screenshot of what the report looks like coming out of that tool. And so let's just dive into it real fast again here, and we can run through a comment submission. So again, this is a development site and a work in progress, and we value comments if people see ways to improve the system. They're welcome, but we're tight timeline. We're working quickly. But we go through looking at all of the requests that have been submitted, and you can sort any of these by these fields at the top. So what I'm going to do is sort these fields by the current status, and you can see here are 2 that have been submitted that are completed. So as a commenter, I've received an email from the department saying that the Santa Maria Basin has a completed request submission and is available for comment. I can now come to this and I can click on the comment link. And at this point, you can scroll down. You can see all of the comments that have been submitted. You can print preview all of the comments, which will have who the commenter is, what their comment was, the response that may have been submitted by the requesting agency, any attachments that were provided, and so forth and so on. If we want to add a comment, we simply click Add Comment. You fill out your contact information, your email address. You can see there's specific required fields that must be in there. Those are particular to the regulation. Any additional information, you need to indicate whether or not this is in support of the request, it is somewhere in between and providing additional information, or you're opposing this request. Here in the comment box, you can add specific comments in text form, or you may choose to submit a file, a written Word document, something along those lines, where you've written this up in a scientific study or something along those lines. Maybe it's a map, and simply populate those things and submit your comment from that point. At that point, it would populate this line item and would be incorporated into this list and part of the submission package that the department will review. I do want to point out that the department will not be responding to any comments, but the comments will be used in the evaluation process. Those that will respond to the comments are the requesting agencies. And again, this really points back toward local management. We want these issues to be resolved on a local basis because that's ultimately where the management is going to be held, and these conflicts need to be resolved at that level. So again, the comment process is very straightforward and simple. It's very transparent and available to all users. The public can pop in and view. They don't need to submit a comment, but you can view them. And it's all available through the system, and you can access it, directly from the DWR Basin Boundary website. I think that's about it in terms of request or comment. Yes, request submission and the comment. It's a fairly straightforward process, and again, we're developing some instructional guidelines to how to navigate this system. Some of that information will be on there. I guess we can kind of go through some of the next steps before we dive into more questions. So January 1 opens our first boundary modification submission period. It's a 3-month window and runs through March 31st, at which time it will close. One question that might come up is, after that closing date, a modification that say may be submitted on the 31st, there is still a 30-day comment period following that, following the completeness review. So know that those statutes still hold. By September 2016, the department plans to have an approved draft list of boundaries and present to the California Water Commission for hearing and comment. And then by early 17, DWR will publish the final basin boundaries in an addendum to Bulletin 118. So I've alluded to throughout the conversation several documents which are upcoming to aid local agencies in navigating this process. One of them is the submission worksheet. That'll be an offline tool for you to use to take notes, to prepare for consolidation of your materials and a checklist, if you will, to submit all the required information. The BBMRS tool guidance. This will effectively be a screenshot-based walkthrough of the system. So they'll simply have screenshots of each target and instruct users as to how to populate and submit their information. There's currently a checklist up on the website. I wanted to point out that we are updating that checklist to include additional links to resources that may help local agencies to identify and find information to populate the request submission. And we'll be posting a new FAQ for the basin boundary modifications, and we'll incorporate probably a lot of these comments we're receiving today. Again, the presentation will be posted online. There's a lot of critical links here. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. If you have questions about SGMA, the regulations, and how it's going to roll out, start here. This is the governing web page and has direct links to everything you see below. So that's a great starting point, very easy to access. Again, I'll post this presentation, and you should have those links via that method if you don't already know where this is. The Basin Boundary Modifications website, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency website, the Groundwater Sustainability Plan Regulations. Here's a link to the Groundwater Management email list. So this is a key one. You want to be informed of what's going on. This is the primary mechanism by which the department is passing updated information out. And we'll be submitting, or we'll be sending out at a minimum, every other week emails to show updates to submissions, but lately they've been coming a little more frequently than that as there's a lot of activity going on with the program. And I also wanted to point out that local agencies have some grant opportunities out there to aid in formation of GSAs and other planning opportunities, and there's a link for that. But all of these links are available through this primary web link at the top for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. Again, I told you about the contact information. So here are the critical contacts, the regional offices, the Northern Region Office, the North Central, the South Central, the Southern, and here in headquarters you can feel free to reach out to me as well. But these are the primary contacts with respect to the basin boundary modification process at this point. These will be made available as well online. So I guess at that point we can dive into some broader question and answer.
Yes, and I think maybe, Bill, what we should do is take any questions first that are specific to the public input procedure. Since we didn't take a pause after that presentation piece, and then we'll go ahead and zoom back out and see what other questions are still remaining.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions related to when someone submits a notification, is there a way of informing the public that another or a request has been submitted?
Yeah. So one, the tool is available on the website. It's publicly available. Anybody can view that. Two is the SGMA or the SGM program email listserv, which I just pointed out. That's the best way to get regular updates as to activity that is going on within your basin. And it'll simply be, you can look down and see, this is the basin I'm interested in, there's activity. You can click on the link and it's going to take you right to that tool.
Okay, and then could you also clarify a little bit as to the timing and ability for individuals to post comment to requests? So in other words, does a request have to be formally submitted for someone to actually make comments on that request, or can it be, or can comments be made anytime?
Great, good question. Yeah, we're limiting the window of opportunity to provide comment until a requesting agency has submitted the application and the department has deemed that application complete. Once that application is deemed complete, a 30-day opportunity to provide comment is initiated and is running. At that point in time, the comment function becomes available and anybody can provide comment.
Tim, would you mind putting the link slide back up?
Yeah.
That request has come in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so other questions?
I think those are the specific questions related to the last thing that Tim talked about, but there are other questions I'd like to open up as sort of the general question category.
Good. I think we saw some good time to navigate some.
Okay, good. So how does an agency or water district know if they're eligible to request a basin boundary modification?
Sure. So SGMA defines a local agency as a local agency with water use or land use eligibility or authority. Thank you. Whew, it's been a long morning. And so that is the definition that is used within the basin boundary modification regs. So one of the things that you want to do when evaluating the regs is be sure to have a copy of SGMA, because those definitions are used in both the legislation itself as well as the regulation. And so there's a very clear definition as to who is eligible.
Okay, and then there are a few questions related to CEQA. So could you go over the CEQA requirements? And There were a couple that were very specific that we probably would have to run through our legal department. So
yeah.
Some of those very specific questions could be answered later, but just in general, can you just talk about CEQA?
Sure. So the requirement to make a statement about CEQA, sorry, is there just so local agencies recognize that that they are deciding to modify this basin, and in doing so, they are doing some investigation and consolidation of information, and are therefore identified as the lead agency in this case. And that they need to make the determination as to whether or not their basin boundary modification, in other words, the change of the line work, would constitute a project under CEQA. And what I've heard interpreted by other local agencies, in most cases, that isn't being interpreted as being a project and is therefore exempt from CEQA. The regulations require that some statement to that effect, what the local agency, the lead agency, what their interpretation of their modification request is, and it will be up to them to decide what is the most appropriate action to take with regards to CEQA.
Okay. So getting back to the administrative edit process. As we mentioned earlier, DWR is reviewing basin boundaries. And there's one question, is what are we doing to prevent duplicative efforts in adjusting basin boundaries, of reviewing basin boundaries and making adjustments to that?
Sure. So the BBATS tool, as I pointed out, has identified those administrative edits which the department is planning on making. So that line work is available and reviewable on the BBATS tool. When you go to provide your GIS coverage, the coverage you download of the basin you are modifying includes that administrative edit line work. So you'll be editing the most recent line work that is available and reflects those administrative edits. And we alluded to other edits with regards to geologic contacts, and that's part of the department's existing authority under Water Code 12924, and those edits, we're prioritizing and reviewing, but they aren't ready to roll out. So as we see requests coming in, or initial notifications, I believe, Bill, and correct me if I'm wrong, that will be something that we can review on a case-by-case basis to see if it's coincident with a potential modification that we were considering, and how to proceed from there.
Yeah, so if I could maybe elaborate on a couple of those things. So the BBATS tool shows the current recommended administrative adjustments to county lines, to basins where they are using county lines or hydrology, such as rivers, as their boundaries. So DWR went in and reviewed those boundaries and made adjustments to fit the map better. And then there's a team of region office staff that are going over the geologic maps and the geologic boundaries. And we're really looking at the most significant issues where there's real problems. So if we see an initial notification, so by using the initial notification tool that is coincident with an area that we're reviewing, then that would sort of highlight that area and allow us to prevent duplicative efforts. So we could reach out to that agency that submitted that initial notification and just, and have a discussion about what their request might be.
Right.
And then one thing to really point out is that any administrative edits are based directly on Bulletin 118's written description, and for administrative edits to be made, the written description needs to be unambiguous. So if there is an unclear description, that is something that we would not recommend an administrative change on.
And just to add to that, in terms of the scientific contact information, navigating the process for submission of an external scientific boundary modification is relatively streamlined. And that information, the scientific support, it can simply be the geologic map and interpretation of that contact. And so that process isn't difficult if the department isn't currently evaluating or prioritizing that specific edit highly enough to make in this round. The department will continue to review boundary definitions, moving forward as part of our existing authority, but at this point, I think they're fairly stable.
Okay, so I think you touched on this briefly in the presentation, but what if multiple local agencies submit requests for changes to the same basin, so different changes to the same basin? Or what if local agencies can't agree on what change to make, and they're basically competing requests? How will DWR address that?
Sure. Let's take an example of a very large basin or sub-basin, and local agencies might be at opposite ends of the basin, and making a modification at opposite ends of the basin, we don't see a conflict there, and we could envision individual requests for those modifications. It's when the modifications of the line work either coincide or directly conflict that the department is going to require coordination of that submission. And the department, as I stated earlier, is not going to make a determination as to which one is the best. That's going to be left to the local to resolve. And if it's not resolved and the combination request is not submitted, then the boundary modification won't be considered for modification. So it's purely a locally driven issue. If there's conflict, it will be resolved on a local basis.
Okay. So there's another question about, let's see, how do I phrase this properly? If DWR approves a basin boundary change, could an agency come back and ask that be re-reviewed?
If they approve the change?
Yeah, if DWR accepts a basin boundary change, or I'm sorry, no, I got that backwards. If DWR denies the basin boundary change, can the agency come back and sort of re-ask?
Well, that really ties into the timeline of what we have for this window of opportunity. And at this point, there isn't significant opportunity to reevaluate or reiterate. However, there are plenty of opportunities to be heard. The California Water Commission, an agency can voice their change or opinion of that fact, and the department will consider, based upon comments, through the final finalization process and finalizing these edits. So there are a couple of avenues for the department to hear those arguments, but there's a very specific process we have laid out, and the timeline is such that we're going to have to stick to it. There won't be time to resubmit additional information, I should say. But if conversation can reveal that this is a change that is supported and merited, that meets the sustainable the likelihood of sustainable management of the basin, then that's something the department can consider on a one-by-one basis.
Okay, so if you're making a change to an internal boundary within a basin, it by definition affects an adjacent basin. So is that a request to change the boundary in one basin, or is that a request to change the boundary in two basins?
Well, I mean, effectively it's two. But the way the department is viewing that is that the requesting agency resides in one basin. So that modification will be centered around that basin in which the requesting agency resides. It does affect an adjacent basin, and there are specific requirements of notification and consultation with the affected basin and the adjacent basin to agree with that modification. So that's part of the information the requesting agency must provide as part of the submission package.
Okay, well, I think there are other questions, but I think most of these are better, or I think they are better addressed in writing as we go through all of them.
Okay.
I think we've covered all of the topics in the request or the questions here.
Thank you, Bill. And as we said earlier in this presentation, this webinar will be made available on the SGMC website, as will the presentation. And these questions will also be addressed in an FAQ document that DWR will be developing as well. Tim, would you like to add to that and make some closing remarks?
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody tuning in and participating. These questions and comments were excellent. I do want to reemphasize that none of these questions are going to go unanswered. We'll be downloading this list of comments and questions, and I'll be reviewing this. I hope to get back to people as quickly as possible. I really valued the comments that we were able to address during the webinar. I think they really helped to hit the highlights and key components of the regulation and how to navigate it. I would just encourage all the local agencies to reach out to the region offices, reach out to the department. We're willing to answer questions and work through problems, and be prepared. This is part of SGMA. This is a coordinated effort, and it's a local effort. So reach out to the local agencies around you and start that coordination process early. It's going to be critical moving forward. It's going to help you manage the basin in the long run, and we're here to help.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim and Bill, for your work today, as well as Nicole, who's really been on the tech piece. We wish you all a very happy holiday. Hope you can take